They demolished my grandfather's hand-built limestone bridge with a rented bulldozer at 6:00 and Oppos clock on a Tuesday morning, standing there in their expensive athleisure while filming the destruction on their iPhones like it was some kind of twisted victory parade. What those people didn't know was that I'm not just a retired widower who likes his privacy. I'm a structural engineer with 40 years of experience in regional planning, and more importantly, I'm the guy who owns the only access road into their million-dollar gated community. By the time the dust settled into the creek that morning, I wasn't thinking about a lawsuit anymore. I was thinking about how much it was going to cost them to realize that property rights work both ways, and brother, business was about to get very expensive for the Clear Creek HOA. My name's Elias Thorne. I'm 62 years old, and I live on 140 acres of rugged, beautiful North Carolina backwoods about an hour outside of Asheville. It's the kind of place where the air smells like damp pine needles and wood smoke, where you can hear the Blue Ridge Mountains breathing if you sit still long enough, and where my family has lived since the late 1920s. My grandfather, Silas, was a man who believed that if you built something with your hands, you were putting a piece of your soul into the earth. And in 1946, after coming home from the war, he built a stone arch bridge over what we call Copperhead Run. He hauled every single one of those river rocks up from the bank himself, hand-milling the timber for the decking and forging the iron bolts in a small shed that still stands behind my barn. That bridge wasn't just a crossing. It was a handshake between generations, a piece of history that survived floods, ice storms, and the slow crawl of time, at least until the developers arrived 18 months ago. They bought up the old Miller farm next door and turned it into, and quote, the sanctuary at Clear Creek, end quote, which is a fancy name for 85 identical houses with white siding and gray shutters, populated by people who moved to the mountains to get away from the city, but brought every bit of city arrogance with them. Leading the charge was a woman named Victoria Vance, a high-stakes real estate closer who wore her blonde bob like a weapon and treated the HOA presidency like she was the governor of a small, hostile nation. Victoria had decided about 3 months into her tenure that my property was and quote, visual liability, end quote, to their luxury brand, and she started sending me these glossy, perfumed letters demanding I, end quote, remediate, end quote, my bridge because it didn't, and Oppos, to meet the aesthetic guidelines of their community. I tried to be the good neighbor. I really did, walking over there in my work boots to explain that my bridge sat entirely on my deeded land and predated their neighborhood by nearly 8 decades. But Victoria just gave me this thin, shark-like smile and said, and quote, Elias, honey, we're trying to elevate this area, and your little pile of rocks is just, well, it's a drowning hazard, and it has to go, end quote. I told her to stay off my dirt and went back to my porch, thinking that would be the end of it. But when you're dealing with people who have never been told in Oppos, no in Oppos, by someone in a flannel shirt, things escalate quickly. On that Tuesday morning, the roar of a diesel engine woke me up before the sun was even over the ridge, and by the time I got down to the creek in my boots and a bathrobe, the center arch of Silas's bridge was already a pile of rubble in the water. Victoria was standing there with 2 other board members, holding a Starbucks cup in one hand and her phone in the other, nodding as the operator of the backhoe took another swing at the timber railing. I felt a heat in my chest that I haven in Oppos. T felt since my wife passed away, a cold, focused kind of rage that settles in your bones. And I didn't in Oppos. T screamed, didn't in Oppos. T throw a fit. I just walked right up to her while the dust was still hanging in the air. I asked her if she had a permit for demolition on private property, and she didn't in Oppos. T even look at me, just flicked her eyes toward the operator and said, and quote, the HOA has an easement for environmental safety. Mr. Thorne, we're just doing the county a favor by removing this eyesore before it collapses into the runoff, end quote. I pointed to the heavy iron bracket my grandfather forged in 1946, now twisted and half submerged in the mud, and I told her as quietly as I could that she had just made the biggest mistake of her professional life. She laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed off the trees, and told me that her legal team at the firm in Charlotte would be happy to send me a bill for the demolition costs since I wasn't, quote, unwilling to maintain a safe perimeter, end quote. The local sheriff came out about an hour later, a guy named Miller who I've known since he was in diapers, but his hands were tied because Victoria had produced a falsified, end quote, emergency hazard, end quote, report signed by a local landscaping company. He told me it was a civil matter, that I'd have to take them to court to get a dime. And as I watched them drive away, leaving my history in a heap of broken stone, I realized that playing by the rules of a rigged game was how you lost. I spent the next 48 hours in my home office, which is filled with old survey maps, property deeds, and regional planning documents from my years working with the state, and I started digging into the archives of the Thorne Estate. You see, back in the 50s, when the county was first laying out the rural routes, my father had made a series of land swaps to help the local farmers get their cattle to market, and one of those swaps involved a narrow, winding strip of land called Blackwood Lane. Today, Blackwood Lane is the only paved entrance into the sanctuary. It's the road their kids take to school, the road their Amazon packages come down, and the road Victoria Vance drives her Range Rover on every single morning. I pulled the original handwritten deed from 1954 out of a cedar chest, and my hand started to shake when I saw the ink. My father had never formally dedicated that road to the county. He had only granted a, quote, revocable personal easement, quote, to the Miller family for agricultural use. When the developers bought the Miller farm, they assumed the road was public, and Victoria's legal team had been too lazy to check the actual metes and bounds of the Thorne deed. I called up an old friend of mine, a pit bull of a land use attorney named Arthur Sterling, and we met at a diner in Asheville where the coffee is strong enough to strip paint. I laid the deeds out on the table, next to the photos of my smashed bridge, and Arthur's eyes lit up like a kid on Christmas morning as he realized what we had. He told me that not only was the road entirely mine, but the utility easements for their fiber optic internet and their high-pressure water lines had been stapled to that same agricultural agreement, which had technically expired the moment the Miller farm ceased to be a working dairy operation in 2004. I was sitting on the literal jugular of an entire 85-home neighborhood, and the woman who had just bulldozed my grandfather's soul was about to find out that, quote, elevating the area, quote, was going to cost her everything she owned. Before we went nuclear, Victoria decided to twist the knife one more time by having the HOA's legal team file a, quote, nuisance injunction, quote, against me, claiming that my remaining barn was a fire hazard and demanding that I pave my gravel driveway to, quote, reduce dust pollution, quote, for residents. She even started a thread on the community's private Nextdoor page, calling me a, quote, bitter hermit, quote, who was suffering from, quote, cognitive decline, quote, since my wife died, and she encouraged people to call code enforcement on me every time I started my tractor. I sat on my porch and watched the white SUVs roll past my house, people looking at me like I was a stain on their perfect mountain view, and I just waited for the clock to strike midnight on the 30-day notice Arthur had drafted. The morning the notice was delivered, I hired a local crew to bring in 2 massive concrete Jersey barriers and a, quote, road closed, private property, quote, sign, and at exactly 9 a.m., we blocked the entrance to Blackwood Lane. About 10 minutes later, the first Mercedes came to a screeching halt, followed by a school bus, followed by Victoria in her Range Rover, honking her horn like the world was ending. I was standing there in my work vest, holding a clipboard, and when she rolled down her window to scream that I was, quote, blocking a public thoroughfare, quote, I just leaned over and handed her a copy of the 1954 deed and the formal revocation of the easement. Quote, morning, Victoria, quote, I said, my voice as calm as a mountain lake. Quote, actually, this is a private driveway that belongs to the Thorne Estate, and as of 9 minutes ago, the agricultural easement granted to the Millers has been terminated for breach of terms, specifically the unauthorized destruction of Thorne property by a non-permitted party. Quote, she looked at the paper, then at me, her face turning a shade of red that I didn't oppose. No was biologically possible, and she shrieked that she was going to have me arrested for kidnapping an entire neighborhood. I pointed to the secondary logging trail 3 miles back, a muddy, unpaved goat track that hadn't oppose. Been graded since the 70s, and told her that was the new official detour for the sanctuary. It would add 45 minutes to their commute and probably take the oil pan off any car lower than a Jeep. But hey, I wasn't oppose. The one who started playing with property lines. The next 3 days were pure, unadulterated chaos. And I'm not going to lie, I enjoyed every second of it. The HOA's law firm tried to get an emergency injunction to force the road open, but Arthur met them at the courthouse with a stack of maintenance records showing that I was the one who had been paying the property taxes on that asphalt for the last 20 years. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who had grown up in the holler, took one look at the photos of my demolished stone bridge and told the HOA's lawyers that if they wanted to use Mr. Thorne's private driveway, they should probably start by figuring out how to pay him back for what they broke. While the residents were losing their minds over the 3-mile detour, I decided to do a little more digging with the help of a guy named Silas. The son of the treasurer Victoria had recently ousted for asking too many questions about the budget. Silas was a numbers guy, and he brought me a thumb drive full of HOA bank statements that showed Victoria had been paying, in quote, consulting fees, in quote, to a shell company owned by her own brother-in-law to the tune of $15,000 a month. She wasn't an oppos. Just a bully. She was a thief, using the neighbors and oppos dues to fund her lifestyle while claiming the HOA was too broke to fix the drainage issues that were actually causing the flood risks she'd blamed my bridge for. We leaked the financial documents to a local investigative reporter, and by Friday evening, the news vans were parked at the roadblock, interviewing furious homeowners who were finding out for the first time that their, in quote, fearless leader, in quote, was embezzling their money while making them drive through a mud pit to get to work. The pressure cooker finally blew at the emergency community meeting that Sunday, held in the middle of the street because I wooed and oppos. Let them use the road to get to the community center. Victoria tried to stand on a folding chair and explain that it was all a, in quote, misunderstanding, in quote, but the residents wearing and oppos. Having it. They had seen the photos of my grandfather in oppos. Bridge, they had seen the bank statements, and they had spent 4 days getting stuck in the mud on a logging trail. Arthur and I walked into the middle of that crowd, and the silence that fell over those 85 families was so thick you could have carved it. I didn't end oppos. Look at the crowd. I looked straight at Victoria, who was shivering despite the humidity, and I told her my terms. In quote, first, in quote, I said, in quote, I want my bridge rebuilt. Not a modern concrete slab, but a hand-laid stone arch using the original river rocks that are currently sitting in my creek. I've already contacted a master stonemason out of Virginia who specializes in historical restoration, and the quote is $240,000, which the HOA will pay in full. End quote. Victoria started to protest, but a man in the front row, a guy who I later found out was a retired colonel, told her to shut up or he'd personally walk her to the sheriff's office. I continued, end quote. Second, I want a written, notarized apology for the slanderous comments made about my family and my mental health to be published in the regional paper and pinned to the top of your community page for 1 year. Third, I will grant a new, permanent public easement for Blackwood Lane, but the HOA will pay me a usage fee of $2,000 a month, which will be placed into a trust to fund the local volunteer fire department in my wife's name. And finally, Victoria, you're going to resign from this board, and you're going to give back every cent you've funneled to your brother-in-law, or Arthur here is going to hand that thumb drive to the district attorney tonight. End quote. She tried to look for a friend in that crowd, but every single person, the family she had lied to, the neighbors she had bullied, the people whose property values she had put at risk, just stared at her with a cold, hard indifference. She resigned that night, effective immediately, and moved out of the sanctuary 3 weeks later, selling her Range Rover to cover the legal fees and the restitution she owed the community. The new HOA board, led by the colonel and the former treasurer, Kuden and Oppos, had been nicer. They brought over a crate of peaches and a handwritten card, and they didn't in Oppos. Complained once about the stonemason's bill. It took 6 months for the new bridge to be finished, and I spent every day down there by the creek, watching the mason carefully fit the limestone pieces back together, following the original sketches my grandfather had made in a leather-bound notebook back in Oppos, 46. On the day we opened it, the whole neighborhood came over for a barbecue on my lawn. No white SUVs, no Range Rovers, just people walking across the stone, feeling the history under their feet. I stood there with my grandkids, watching them run across the wooden planks I'd helped my own father replace 40 years ago, and I realized that the bridge wasn't just a way to get across the water anymore. It was a reminder that you can't build a future by destroying the past, and you sure as hell can't bully a man who knows exactly where his property line ends. But now that the dust has settled and the creek is running clear again, I've been thinking about something the Colonel said to me at the barbecue. He said that while he was glad I won, he felt like the whole situation showed how dangerous it is for one person to have that much power over a community and Oppo's access to the world. It's got me wondering, did I do the right thing by using the road as a weapon, or did I just become a different kind of bully to get what I wanted? The HOA is gone, Victoria is gone, and my bridge is back, but some of the neighbors still won't look me in the eye when they drive past the Thorne estate. So, I'm putting it to you, was I justified in holding 85 families hostage to get justice for my grandfather, or should I have just taken the bridge demolition to court like A in quote? Normal in quote. Person? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and tell me if you think property rights should ever be used to settle a personal grudge. I'm curious to see where you draw the line between justice and revenge. And if you want to see what happened when the new board found out Victoria had hidden another $50,000 in the communities in quote, landscaping in quote, budget, make sure you hit subscribe and ring that bell. The next update is going to be even messier.